Hey, everybody, and welcome to The Brand Called You. So I'm super excited to have our guest today, Charmaine Wijeyesinghe, because Charmaine is really an expert in the complexities of race. She is a consultant, an educator, an editor, and an author of a book, the editor of a book a couple of years ago called The Complexities of Race, in which she tries to really look at the nuances and the specificity of why it is that we find race so confusing. And it's all the more, I think, relevant now that Kamala Harris is possibly the next president of the United States and all that is surrounding her, all that is swirling about race. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to understand its complexities, why it is that we are struggling with it still. And that's why I'm so happy to have you, Charmaine. Welcome. Welcome. It's just a pleasure to have you here. I mean, you've really spent the better part of your professional career, among other things, studying this issue. So why is it so complex?
Well, thank you, Lisa, for the chance to dialogue with you and share some thoughts with listeners. I will talk about the complexities of race in just a minute, but I want people to understand that as we talk, I'm talking as Charmaine. I'm not talking for an entire racial group. I'm not talking for a group that people may believe I'm a part of based on my physical characteristics, or from the group that I actually do reflect by demographic categories. I'm basically talking and sharing thoughts from my experiences over about 40 years of consulting and interacting with some amazing people along the way of my work and my writing, and many different authors, some of whom I might mention today. Um, and a bit more about myself. I'm the child of immigrants, so that influences my perspectives on race. And I grew up in the Northeast, and that is going to influence my perspective on race because race is also um, influenced by geography and what we're taught based on geographical location, both in the United States and around the world. And then I don't know if you mentioned this, a significant part of my background is that I studied at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I have a master's degree from there and a doctoral degree in social justice education and organizational development. And during that time of my studies, I was working with some prominent racial identity theorists like Bailey Jackson and Rita Hardiman when I did my own doctoral work on multiracial identity. And since then, I have interacted with a number of people and worked with a number of people on issues of race and racism in the United States, as well as other forms of oppression. And we may be touching on that in our talk too, about the idea of intersectionality and how other forms of oppression like sexism, like heterosexism, ableism, ageism, classism influence race and make it even more complex. So that's what I want to just start out with. Saying I'm talking from Charmaine, and I'm not talking for all people, and all brown people or all people my age, etc., and all people who were born and raised in the Northeast. So I wanted to just say that. Um, I think part of we can even start by the complexity of race because we don't agree on the definition. Um, for some people, racism is individual attitudes and behaviors. So I may say something and someone will say that's racist. It's based in Charmaine's attitudes and behaviors. Um, I will say that race is infused in the culture and politics and the policies of every country and every region. So it operates on many different levels. It is in individual at individual levels. It is infused in our culture, our norms, and our values, and it's in our institutions, like in education, in policy and politics, things like that, housing. So it's multiple leveled, but we may not all agree that that's what it is either. And again, one of the other things we might chat about is I call it the arc of my thinking, the arc of my career. I have come to realize that racism exists and is supported by the other forms of oppression. That's where intersectionality comes in. And you may know from my bio that I have been working in the studying and writing about and questioning myself and my knowledge based on an intersectional lens since about 2010. So that might come into our conversation, that race is supported by other forms of oppression, in my view. And that's complex too, because some people will say no. race is singular, race may be the most pressing form of oppression in the United States, or someone may say, no, classism is. So how do we think of them as interrelated? And how do we do racial justice work or social justice work if we take that lens? So I'm gonna stop talking for a second and see if you want to ask me a question about that.
I mean, wow. Yeah. I mean, I think what you've reminded all of us that are not in academia, it's not simple. And I think what fascinates me is also how our notion of race changes over who is in power at any given moment, what is happening, what is the demographic, and it's changed so much over time. So I guess I wanted, if it's all right with you, I mean, I would love to just try to identify sort of, for example, you know, uh, how is it that we in today's lens, why is it that we for example, with a Kamala Harris, why is it that we still seem to need to understand whether she's one or the other? That what I guess fascinates me is, why do we have such a hard time with people that have both, you know, two ethnicities, and why the need to just pigeonhole them into one? It seems that we still need to do that.
Yeah. So we're kind of transitioning into another area that I specialize in. It was just kind of the idea of multiracial identity and multiracial people, and the concept of races through singular racial categories versus multiple and even what you can say evolving categories. Because Kamala Harris, just so my background, my doctoral work was on people who had Black and white ancestry,
Right.
who chose different racial identities. And that work was done in the late 80s and early 90s.
Okay.
And so there's a whole body of work now.
Sorry, I know it's very, very broad, but I think it'll help give me
No,
context.
no, no. And so I'm laying the background here. So and so in terms of the passage of time, I'm just say you're right, race is affected by changing demographics, changing norms, changing values. And that's one of the other reasons why it's complex. It's always changing. It will
Right.
always be here. It will always be here, because some people say, oh, that, racism. So we're talking about race, but it's also the grounding for racism. Racism was something we took care of in the civil rights movement, or, some people have said to me, well, my family didn't own slaves. Why? So that is like trying to get a sense that race is bounded by time or racism, and that we've moved on from there. We're in a post-racial society, where in fact I will propose that racism and race will always be with us. It's just going to be changing. It's going to be morphing into different forms. It's good. So in terms of identity, and whether it's Kamala Harris, I'm a multiracial person, and one of the things will know about me that I'll share now is I didn't always identify as multiracial. So I now work with a number of colleagues who are 30 to 35 years younger than I am, who are multiracial scholars and practitioners. And so we'll use this idea as a way of influencing how time changes things. So when I was researching multiracial identity in the 1980s and the 1990s, I talked about, people could only check one box in a form. Okay, since 2000, the census changed, you can check multiple boxes. So that is a systemic change in policy and practices that allow people with multiple racial heritages to identify with any of those heritages they wanted to. And so, Kamala Harris, we can look at Barack Obama, also a person of multiracial extraction. By the way, all of us are. We just kind of try to pinpoint people. Oftentimes it's Black and white. It tends to get the most attention, but most people are of multiple ethnic backgrounds or multiple racial backgrounds. They may or may not claim them. They may or may not know about those. So the idea of identity is oftentimes there's a concept that I did not develop. It was developed by two colleagues, Mark Johnson Guerrero and Kevin Nadal, called monoracism. So that means a preference for single racial categories. So as if race can only be defined by singular categories: Black, white, Asian, Latino is an interesting category in and of itself, or Native American Indigenous. So the idea of monoracism, so race is complicated because there's multiple forms of it, monoracism says when we have those preferences, if we set up institutions around single racial categories, there is no room for folks who have multiple racial backgrounds who want to claim those multiple
Oh,
backgrounds. And so when you think about census forms or, anything demographic, you go to a doctor's office and the forms are there, and how we set up systems that advantage people to only think of race as singular categories. By the way, those categories are artificial too, which makes race complex. When we think about how do we talk about race itself without language, without the categories,
yeah.
we can't have the conversation, and yet the categories themselves have morphed and changed. I have a colleague, Nancy Lopez, who writes a lot about the census. Those census categories have changed over the years.
Wow.
So to meet certain needs of society. So the categories change, so they can't really be all that real. And the categories were developed themselves to sustain racism during the time of enslavement. So that's where those categories came
Yeah.
from.
It's interesting. You in the book that you edited, Robert Keith Collins has a chapter called "How Did Black Folks Become Indians?" and it's about changing notions of white group affiliation. Maybe you could speak a little about that because that
Sure,
fascinates.
so the same thing. This, I think, is a famous book. I think how Jews became white or something like that. Forgive me if I'm misquoting that. But different ethnic groups or different groups in the United States have come in and been racialized. So there's a concept that's related to race and racism is that people become racialized. So, for example, in Germany, Jews were racialized. They became a race and were exterminated during the Holocaust because they were racialized. Jews were seen as a race. So people coming to the United States in different eras have been racialized also. Okay. So Jews have become white because they've been, absorbed into white culture, white norms, and seen as white in the United States when in fact at earlier times they were maybe not seen
Well,
that way. So people can become racialized. And then Robert Keith Collins's chapter was talking about how Africans and indigenous folks were together over time in the history of the United States, and how they could adopt different cultures and norms and ways of tribal nations, and then be integrated and affiliated with those nations. That's what that chapter's about. So
I mean, as a Jewish person, I'd love to go back to that example you just gave. So, what, why is it possible for one group to slowly become absorbed as white, for example, where in another generation they weren't? Is it purely, what are the factors involved in that kind of change in accepting and absorbing?
I can touch on that too, but I also don't want to lose the idea of Kamala Harris and stuff. So in terms of maybe it relates to some of it. Part of it is there is the idea that people can choose their racial identity. I am this. This is the box I'm checking. Is itself a contested topic. I'm going to use the word contested. I mean, people can disagree about it, and people have feelings about it. That's another reason race is complex. It's because people have emotions about it when it comes up in discussions.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you just made me think of something very interesting. This whole idea of getting to choose what your race is versus somebody imposing it upon you seems like a relatively new idea.
Well, not actually, because that's what part of what that census comes about. So a number of people have used concepts. I use the idea of chosen identity versus ascribed identity. So I'm going to use myself as an example. A number of people, including people who have known me for decades, have assumed that I'm African American based on, I call it this package, okay? And yet some people notice there's differences in my physique that say, no, you're not really, or they recognize the name as being based in Sri Lanka, which is the former British colony Ceylon island off the southern tip of India, where my parents came from. So my chosen racial identity is multiracial. I'm actually Asian and white. But people may ascribe see me as someone who's African American. And so people who try to navigate that, and particularly multiracial people, are oftentimes misraced. People think, you're this, but you're really that. And then how do you navigate that? When do you choose to disclose that you're assuming I'm someone who I'm not? So that on Kamala Harris or Barack Obama or the millions of people walking around this earth with parentage of different racial ethnic groups. I don't want to just focus on the famous folks. They have to navigate that. And that's part of the modern racism that Mark Johnson Guerrero and Kevin Nagel talked about, is that when we think in, I use the word lens of that race has to be this or that, either or, we can negate the experience of people who blur those boundaries. Okay, so sometimes, and people do have to navigate, like, so I will look at you, I'm seeing you on my Zoom screen, I might assume, oh, she could be white or she could be something else. Because we use race as oftentimes based on physical appearances, or people's perception of physical appearance, and that changes based on what nation you're in, what region of the country you're in. So again, that feeds the complexities of race. We oftentimes are going on what we believe to be the physical. So how can people become white in the United States? How some groups can and some groups can't. Part of it is by being assimilated into different culture or bringing something into the culture of America at a given time and place that then becomes assimilated into it. Food, customs, and things like that, and appearance. So
Yeah.
it's hard to say. So people who may be viewing the podcast and who are sighted and can see me will see that I'm a medium brown woman. It's going to be tough for me to become white in America. Does that make sense?
It does, I not I keep bringing it back to myself, and I hope this will lead back to Kamala again. But I remember in the 70s, growing up in New Jersey, there was one doctor that was Dr. Diamond, did all the nose jobs on all my Jewish friends. And I, of course, didn't do it. But in retrospect, years later, I think it's really addressing exactly what you're talking about, which is to somehow appear to be part of the larger white majority and to fit in a way that I found very strange. But
Well, that's the idea of standards of beauty. So that's, again, when we think about one of the things about race and racism at a systemic level, of cultural level, you think about standards of beauty and what's valued and what's not at any given time. Some people will try to say, well, I want to emulate that because in America, that's what it means to be beautiful at this moment. So
yeah.
some
Let me
change
let
their
me ask.
appearance and things like that. But people change
Yeah.
their appearance for lots of reasons.
Yeah.
Some people will say some
Well,
people,
I was thinking
some
we
people
had the big
don't.
nose. We had the big nose, which sort of precluded us from being part of the.
Yeah.
But I also wonder, aside from looks, what are some of the other factors that enable people to somehow, be integrate? So, for example, is money, how important is that? Or what are some of the other factors involved besides physical appearance?
Huh. Well, I think to some extent, as you said, access to resources, and education. But again, I don't want to stereotype some of those aspects to say
Mhm.
that that makes you white. So if you attend this university, you're whiter than somebody else. So I don't want to. It's hard to engage in that conversation. But let's talk about you. You had asked me before we started talking about intersectionality. What does that mean?
Yeah.
So that also makes race complex. So race is identity. We talked about Charmaine. We talked about some famous people about how they identify and how they are identified. That is adds to the complexity of race because there's these variables that we walk around assuming people who they may are or may not be, that some people are able to assimilate, that's an
Yeah.
interesting concept, even an interesting word, into American culture more easily than some others perhaps. That feeds complexity of race. We talked a bit about systemic stuff like standards of beauty or access to education and resources.
Mhm.
That's adds to complexity of race. But the idea of intersectionality also complicates race. That race, to me, this is Charmaine's version of it, but Charmaine has been informed by lots of other people who've written about this, so I don't want to take credit for all of this. But to me, race and our study of race and our work to eradicate racism cannot be separated from those other forms of
Yeah.
inequality. Because
Yeah.
let's say, for example, I want to work on voting rights, okay? And I want to make sure I do education around voting. if I am not aware of how my language, my approach to people may be stereotypical in terms of folks who are queer or trans, or if I'm holding my event in a place that is inaccessible to folks who are have physical limitations or
Mhm.
physical disabilities or physical conditions that aren't going to allow them, for example, to use the stairs that I'm going to use in this building to register people, then think I'm doing racial justice work, but I'm also disqualifying some people.
Yeah.
Some of them may be people of color, some of them might be white, who want to engage in that work with me because I'm not mindful of those other forms of inequality that are present and supporting racism. When we think about racial stereotypes, oftentimes they draw on gender. They're different. Some of my writing talks about this. The stereotypes of African American men are different to me than some of the stereotypes of, for example, Asian men. And I believe that's informed partly by gender stereotypes, by stereotypes by around sexual orientation. And so again, the systems of sexism, classism, homophobia is the term we used to use back in the day, inform our work in racism. And when you look back in the civil rights movement, there were several gay and lesbian activists who were very active in racial justice then, who did not who were silenced. That part
Yeah.
of their
Yeah.
background was silenced, or told, well, that's not relevant right now. We're working on race. And so they weren't able to bring necessarily their full selves to that work. So we think about how racial justice advocates can oppress other people, even when they think we're doing racial justice work, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. And
No, it's
you used to work before
yeah.
academics, and people, those of us who aren't in the academy, race touches, I'm going to say this flat out, race touches people's lives day to day in the grocery store, on your way to work, in the workplace, on the playground. So it's not, sometimes when people talk about, well, we're talking about race as the elites. No, my great colleague and mentor, Billy Jackson, once said, racism is in the air that we breathe. It is all around us at all times. Now, that again makes race complex because some people will say, no, it's not. I'm just buying this loaf of bread. So I know our time might be coming to a close, but that's one of the things is we
Yeah.
disagree, perhaps, on the prevalence of race in our lives, what it looks like, who experiences it. Wasn't it something we took care of way back when? That makes race complex to talk about today. And again, the feeling part of it is there are certain books that are banned in certain states because we didn't want people to feel bad.
Yeah. Yep.
So I don't want to feel guilty. And I know I'm talking quite a bit, and you may have
No,
something.
it's great. It's
I'm going to
important
say
to me.
this, and then I'm going to let's see if there's a closing question you want to ask me. I think one of the things that holds us back in racial justice work is the idea that we don't want to feel that we're bad people. It comes up a lot. If and my colleague Zach Bosty writes a lot about this also. The need to feel that we're innocent, that we're not racist, we're not wearing a certain, the Klan outfit, we're not carrying torches and saying, people aren't going to replace us. I'm not that, so therefore I am not benefiting from the system of race. I'm not culpable for the system of race. So I think when I've done work and when I do my own work, I have to realize that the idea that people want to be seen as good people is a barrier that I have to overcome. Because we can be the
Yeah.
best people in the world. Part of how these systems of oppression work is they go along happily on their own until we interrupt them. So
No, I mean,
let's see if you have questions. I know I keep talking, but see
that's
what do you
okay. No,
want?
you just, I hadn't thought about this, but during COVID, you remember we were all quite isolated. I was living alone, quite lonely, and I went on Match.com. And right around that time, the Black Lives Matter movement was in full, and I forced myself to stop and reflect. And I realized I had gone by every Black man and I had not chosen any of them. So I went back and I said, damn it, you are going to rethink this. I ended up having the most wonderful time speaking to some lovely men that I would have not even considered. And it didn't, what scared me was that I didn't even realize I wasn't considering it. You know, these assumptions are so stitched into our, and it is absolutely essential that we stop and really reflect. And it doesn't often happen. And I guess my last question to you is, how can we begin to make those
Mhm.
self-reflective changes as a
Sure.
culture?
Mhm. Yeah. And I want to affirm you for sharing that very personal example. And sometimes when people say, "Well, I feel guilty about racism," I don't want to look at it. It makes me feel uncomfortable. I have a colleague named Bobby Harrow who wrote a very kind of famous thing called the cycle of socialization: how we become socialized to accept norms, values, beliefs as if they're truths about multiple groups of people.
That's
And so
interesting.
I tell people, if you find yourself being aware of a racist belief or a stereotype that you believe, all it means is that you learned what you were supposed to learn really well. Doesn't let you off the hook. Doesn't say like, okay, you're a good person, Charmaine. It just means like I was taught by school what was important in history, who were the important people here. Back in the day when I was going through school, most of those people were, white men. Um, and when we turned to our faith leaders, we realized these were the important people, and this is what they look like.
Yeah,
If you think about it in historical context, that is not actually what they look like. But we learn things through all different people and institutions that we interact with as young people and even as adults as we go through life. So we learn things that we're supposed to learn about those groups. Okay. So it means you learn things really well. So what can you do? I think it depends what your goals are as individuals. So if people want to raise their awareness, maybe this podcast like, oh, I never really thought about this. There's lots of great books out there to read and to research and written from lots of different angles. So if you're an academic, you might want to read something. Or if you're a day-to-day person, you might want to read the same thing as the academic, or you might want to read someone's narrative of personal history that may resonate more with you. You can join an organization or that's working to change different aspects of life in the United States to make it more equitable. Okay. You can just even have a discussion group with friends to say, I don't know what race and racism looks like in modern times, but I want to do that. Can we engage in that, realizing that we will make mistakes, we'll offend each other, but we're going to go forward. And my stock line is we go forward with courage and grace. So I will tell you this. I have been doing this work for 40 years. I've interacted with a ton of people. I've read a lot of stuff. I bought a lot of loaves in that of bread in that grocery store and interacted with a lot of people doing that. Again, if racism is around me all the time, that's around me when I'm buying that loaf of bread. I still make mistakes. I still offend people. I am still learning, and I will learn for the rest of my life. So I think part of that other dilemma is we feel like we're going to arrive. I read this book, I read, how to be, an anti-racist, which is a great, good book. I read this, I went to this workshop, I got it. I understand what
yeah,
race and racism and racial privilege, we didn't talk a lot about the concept of privilege, looks like. And I got it. So now I'm good and I don't do anything else. And that may be, again, that feeds the complexities of race. I got it. Now Lisa, you don't have it like I have it. You
right.
should read this book. I'm gonna call you out on every time you make a mistake. I'm gonna make sure I cancel you. I had to figure out what cancel culture is. My kids had to tell me, I'm gonna cancel you for that mistake. If we go
Yeah,
forward with that, a whole lot of us aren't gonna learn anything, and we're gonna go back to just not questioning anything because
yeah,
we're afraid. We want to be seen and as people wanting to learn. So I will leave you with that thought that Charmaine's still learning, and Charmaine's going to learn, and Charmaine's going to make mistakes, and Charmaine's not going to get it because it's always changing. But we should at least, I'm going to encourage people to take a step in their lives, whatever that step may be, because people are different levels of awareness and readiness and time and energy, to take a new step to think about how they can examine race and racism in their lives. Because from Charmaine's perspective, that stuff is there, whether you look at it or not. So whether you read a book, whether you have that conversation, race and racial privilege will be here in the United States and in the world and will function as it's supposed to function unless someone does something about it.
I mean, I can't think of a better note to end on. You've kind of reminded me to consistently question my own assumptions, and also as a professional storyteller to remind myself that for every narrative there's an opposing narrative, and there's an entirely different story being woven from the same set of circumstances. I think, we can use the stories of others, the imagined or real stories of those that are different, to sort of reawaken this understanding in ourselves. But obviously you've really taught me that the first step has to come from your own self and your questioning of yourself.
If I have 1 minute, I love that you use the word narrative.
Yeah.
Because I use that concept a lot in my work now, that there is a dominant narrative.
Yeah.
And that came from somewhere, like who's good and who's bad, which people are able to enter this country and never be questioned of their value and their contributions, and who that comes from somewhere. It serves a purpose, and that's part of what we absorb by watching the news or reading the newspaper of who's good and who's bad, what these people are entering the country for. So this idea of narrative, there is a dominant narrative that surrounds us all the time around race, gender, sexual orientation, able-bodiedness, class, who's deserving, who's
Our
not.
prison system, right? Our prison system.
Yes, yeah,
feeds
absolutely.
that whole notion.
So I love that you, as a storyteller, you brought that into because sometimes we think narratives as the individual voice, which it is. And just like race and racism, it exists on multiple levels, on a cultural level, a political level, and a dominant policy and practical level. So that's a great way to end on that. Those narratives feed the things we're supposed to learn. So let's go out there and learn something different and teach others through our work a different narrative that may push us a little further along towards racial justice.
Thank you so much, Charmaine.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been lovely.
And I will look forward to following you and your really fascinating work. I thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You. Okay. Bye-bye, Charmaine. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.